A pharmacist dedicates his life to research to find cures for diseases that have no solution after being revolted by the fact that doctors gave up his little sister's life when they were still children because there was no cure for her. After working so hard, the pharmacist ends up dying at the age of 31 and wakes up in the body of a 10-year-old boy named Farma in the Middle Ages in a very different world. As he was very confused, Lot, his servant, thinking he had lost his memory after being struck by lightning, explains to him that Farma belongs to an aristocratic family of pharmacists, the Medici. She then notices a mark on his shoulder and says it looked like the sacred mark of the god of drugs, and begins to pray thanking the god for saving her master's life, even as Farma explains that it was a burn from when lightning passes through the skin. As Lot shows that she likes her master, he takes the opportunity to ask her everything. She then, thinking that he had just lost his memory, explains that the Medicis, his family, were the royal pharmacists, and his father had the title of Archduke because he was a nobleman of remarkable ability. He had a mother, a little sister named Blanche, and an older brother named Paul, who was abroad studying medicine at the best university in the world. She explains that his father has high expectations for the two of them, not only as pharmacists, but also as practitioners of the divine arts, powers granted by the gods similar to magic. As he also proves not to remember this, Lot worries because if he could not remember how to use his divine art of water, he could no longer be considered noble and could even be expelled from the estate. He then goes to his room thinking about what Lot had explained. He must remember the shape of the water to perform the divine art. He then tries to imagine the molecular structure of water, and to his astonishment, water begins to leak out of his hand. Not knowing what to do, he throws all the water out the window and ends up wetting Lot, who thanks her master for freshening up and wetting the garden for her. He decides to test creating other elements and discovers that with one hand he could create any substance as long as he knew his molecular structure, and with the other he can eliminate them. Lot comes to the room happy that he has succeeded in his divine art, but worries that he has lost his medicinal knowledge since her father always asks surprise questions during meals. She then takes him to the family library where he finds out that he has studied them since childhood, but when he opens one of the books he realizes that it was like the medical knowledge of Earth, but from centuries ago. And so at dinner, he finally meets his family, finding out that they are lovely, and thinks about how he will now have to live the life of Farma. After his father Bruno asks him a surprise question and he gets it right, he asks if he was feeling well enough to resume his classes. And so the next day we meet his teacher named Ellen, who is the first to notice how he was acting completely differently, as if he were someone else. He gives the same excuse he gave Lot, saying he has lost his memory. She then goes over the basics of the divine arts, explaining that all aristocrats have a guardian divinity, which in the case of his family is the god of drugs, and each one receives an attribute of the divine arts being positive or negative: fire, water, earth, air, and nothingness. But the last one has not been seen for 300 years, if it really existed. He then asks from which attribute would someone be able to create any substance, but she says that such ability was impossible and someone with such power would be a god or a monster. And so they set off to practice, where he discovers that he would need his staff to amplify divine power. As he realizes that he had left his at home, Ellen gives him hers to practice with and asks him to make a water spear, giving a small demonstration. However, when it is Farma's turn, he demonstrates a power far above normal. Ellen gets worried about what was happening and asks him to hold a divinometer, where he would measure his power, and is completely startled to see that he exceeded the divinometer's capacity values and even showed negative and positive attribute, things that have never been seen before. The poor woman is so frightened that she breaks her glasses, and then she sees the sacred mark of the drug god shining on his shoulder and tells Farma that he should never hold a divinometer in front of anyone, even his father, and decides to end the class that day. But since she was without her glasses, Farma helps her to walk back. Then he teaches her a trick, asking her to make a small hole with her fingers and look through it, and she is surprised to see that she could see better that way. But the even bigger surprise was his. As he looks through the hole between her fingers, he sees everything dark, with only a blue light on Ellen's finger, and as he picks it up, he finds that she had twisted it earlier, and after Farma tells her the cause of the injury, the blue light turns white. After explaining what he had seen to Ellen, she is even more frightened to realize that it was the divine eye of the drug god, which she notices that the boy had no shadow, and this is when it really terrifies her for good, and she runs away in fear. The next day, Farma's father tells him that he would not have class that day because Ellen had a high fever and was willing to stop classes, and asks Farma to bring her a letter and a nutritive potion. Since she would need medicine to bring down the fever, which is still non-existent in that world, he decides to create and prescribe the necessary medicine himself. And so he goes to Ellen's house to deliver the letter from her father and the medicines. But she was still afraid of him, and shows up wearing armor thinking he was there to eliminate her for knowing his secret, and starts to think the medicines were poisoned. But he explains that he went there to see how she was doing and to ask her to continue being his teacher, as he needed her to learn about the divine arts, and gives her flowers as a thank you for the time she was his tutor, and apologizes for scaring her, leaving afterwards. She is still a little afraid to take the medicine, but thinking that he was a god, and that gods have no history of harming humans, she decides to take the medicine. After a while, Ellen appears, determined to go back to being his teacher, thanking him for the medicine that had cured her. However, she explains that she would continue to wear armor, and they would train on a desert island as a precaution against an accident. And so the two train with his divine powers, proving to be absurd. Later, he analyzes all the workers in his house with his special vision, making a list of the health problems they had, and then uses his ancient knowledge of medicine to make the medicines with the divine art. And after finishing, he delivers them all, starting with a moisturizer for Lot's parched hands, and notices that all the workers were quite thrilled. Lot explains that the servants have never received medical treatment before, as it is something exclusive to aristocrats, as the cost of medicine was something out of reach for commoners. Farma then reflects that with the medicinal knowledge of the time and the high price of medicines, a mortality rate must be high, and decides that he wants to make medicines available to everyone who needs them, regardless of social class, making Lot all happy. Later at a meal with his family, he discovers that his little sister Blanche had chickenpox, a disease that in that world was still considered super dangerous, and his father asks him to be careful, because even though he had already caught chickenpox and the medicine has not proven it, he says it is possible to reinfect him, leaving Farma impressed with how intelligent his father was, since even on Earth this had been discovered recently. He then uses his powers once again to prepare a medicine for Blanche and goes to her in hiding and asks her to keep the medicine a secret, inventing that he has had knowledge of a book that his father did not know about. Blanche starts scratching herself, and Farma says that this would spread the virus, when he realizes that they were not yet aware of the existence of viruses or bacteria. Then she ends up commenting that Farma had changed, acting like a more loving brother, and says she likes how he was now, making him remember his little sister who had died in his other life. After Blanche heals much faster than usual, thanks to the medicines, he decides to make a microscope to introduce the bacteria to that world. When he is finished, his father says that he received an emergency call from the empress, who was having serious health problems. He explains that Farma would go along with him when he starts coughing steadily. Farma becomes worried and tries to examine his father, but it would be suspicious to do so at that moment, so he leaves it for later. When they arrive at the empress, they are met by the chief court physician, who accompanies them to her, Elizabeth Yu, who really wasn't feeling well at all. After his father examines her using a different method from our world, he begins to prepare himself, and Farma realizes that they were performing a euthanasia, giving up Elizabeth's life as they had given up his little sister's other life. He then decides to examine Elizabeth, discovering that she has tuberculosis, known at the time as the White Plague, a disease that for them had no cure. At this moment, Prince Louis appears in tears, worried about his mother. Farma can't stand still in that situation and asks for permission to treat Elizabeth, saying that there was a new medicine for her. His father tries to stop him, but Elizabeth gives her permission, since he was the only one who still had hope of saving her life. Then Farma begins to prepare the medicines, but his father breaks down the door, trying to stop him, thinking that he was giving false hope to the empress since there was no cure for the White Plague, surprising Farma, who thought that his father did not know about the disease. But he continues to make the medicines, and his father, worried that he is making poison by accident, tries to stop him. But Farma uses his powers to stop his father, making him wonder at such great abilities, when he notices Farma's notebook and demands an explanation from him. Having no other choice, Farma invents that he dreamed about the new drugs the day he was struck by lightning, leading his father to believe that the god of drugs had given him the revelations because of the mark on his shoulder. His father then agrees to let him take the medicine and notices that his son's manner was quite different, making him question whether it was in fact him. After a while, Farma arrives with the medicine and decides to use the moment to show Elizabeth the existence of bacteria, using a sample of it in his microscope, and everyone is astonished to see little worms without quite understanding what they were. Farma explains to Elizabeth how the disease and the medicine worked, and she decides to accept the medicine, feeling confidence in Farma. He explains that it was a long treatment where he himself would accompany the results, and after she takes the medicine, he begins to answer questions from the doctors present, making his father proud. On the way home, his father reflects how he, being a pharmacist, understood his patients, but with Farma, he had not been a very paternal father. Afterwards, Farma gives his father the medicine to take for his cough. He then comments on how he would now have to learn from Farma, since he had been blessed by the god, and gain much more knowledge than he had, but Farma says that he had never treated patients on the brink of death personally before, and it was he who had guided him on how to act, and says that he was still an apprentice who needed his father's help to guide his path. And so the two begin to exchange information, with his father being surprised by the new medicines. His father then comments that some people might want to eliminate him and that there were even suspicions that someone might have infected the Empress on purpose, but Farma doubts it because it was something almost impossible to do. Later, Farma visits Elizabeth to see how she is doing and meets with Lord Noah, who explains to him that the Empress was deciding which reward to give him for saving her life. Farma says that he would not want a reward, but after the Lord insists, he comments that his dream was to open a pharmacy. Later, he meets with Elizabeth, and we see that she was much better. She thanks him for everything, but comments that she was worried about her authority as Empress since everyone thought she was going to die. Farma then comforts her by saying that as long as her son and the people who needed her existed, she would never be useless, and she says that his words are like medicine for the heart. He then comments that he has also seen death up close, and it has made him enjoy his next life more. A few months later, at Elizabeth's request, Farma and his father attend an important ceremony where she grants his father a large territory and promotes Farma, who goes from apprentice to royal pharmacist, and grants him permission to open a pharmacy. After presenting the pharmacy project he had in mind, Farma thinks aloud of some name for it and comments that he never thought he would realize his dream in a parallel world. One of the workers listens and understands that that was the name, and so the pharmacy is built, being named Parallel World Pharmacy. When the head of the Empire's pharmaceutical guild named Varen shows up, he begins to berate Farma because of his age, but the boy maintains his posture. Later, Farma, along with Ellen, think about how they would manage everything, and Lot shows up begging to continue to serve Farma and gets all excited about working together with him in the pharmacy. However, there was still someone missing to handle the store's finances. Arriving home, Farma sees everyone sad and finds out that Mr. Kadrick, one of the servants of the house, was retiring due to a problem with his leg, just the guy trusted to manage the finances of the property. Farma then asks if he would be interested in working in his pharmacy if his leg was cured, and Kadrick is excited by the idea. Afterwards, his father gives Farma a huge amount of money to run his pharmacy with peace of mind, a great gift. And so Farma already had more than enough to start his work. Thus, the place is inaugurated with a long speech by Farma, who openly explains that this was a pharmacy for nobles and plebs, leaving plebs apprehensive and nobles offended by the news. Despite this, Farma was super excited about the realization of his dream. However, after a month with his store open, he realizes that it was going to be harder than he thought. Since the commoners already had their old pharmacists and the nobles usually choose to be served inside their estates, the business of the store was going super poorly. So Lot decides to make a survey around the region about opinions regarding the pharmacy and finds out that most commoners didn't frequent the store because they didn't feel so welcome there, and so they had practically only one regular customer. Later, his parents visit the store and are impressed by their son's professionalism. There was even a bathtub and kitchen in the pharmacy. However, Farma tells of the difficulty of making commoners feel welcome, and his mother suggests he sell cosmetics to aristocrats, saying that if it became popular among the nobles and affordable, plebs would start buying. Farma then remembers when he did some research on cosmetics in his other life to evaluate the safety of the products. But his father warns about the danger of white face powder, explaining that it was something harmful to health, and says he finds it absurd that people compromise their health for looks, commenting that some women even resort to bloodletting to make their skin look pale, which is actually quite drastic. His mother says she understands the impulse of these women, and his father comforts her by saying that she didn't need to because she was already beautiful, and they have a very cute moment together. Suddenly, a man appears looking for Farma and takes him to Lady Chloe, who was in very bad health. He uses his sight and realizes that the young woman had just used the bloodletting method that had infected her. At the pharmacy, Lady Chloe explains that she did the same thing to make herself prettier for a guy who had rejected her for not being so pale. Nonsense, because the lady is beautiful. Farma gives her the necessary medicine, asking her to stop not only the bloodletting as it would put her life at risk, but also to stop using the white powder as it shortened her life. The young woman begins to cry, and he then asks her to come back after a week, and after this time she returns and finds that he has made a cream for her to use on her face that is not harmful to her health and even looks much better than the powder she was using. And it even had sunscreen, something that did not exist at the time, making the lady happy with the product. After that, the store was booming, with the creams becoming more and more successful. With this, the plebs realized that the pharmacy did indeed have affordable prices, and even with pictures to help those who could not read. But with a large number of customers, it became too much for Farma, and the creams ran out too fast. Lady Chloe returns to the store bringing her friends to show them the creams and realizes what was happening and decides to become a partner, hiring top pharmacists who were unemployed to help in the service, which gave a relief in their service and also gave a new job opportunity to the young women. After some time, Lot conducts her public survey again, and everyone is pleased to see that all the comments about the store have been positive. Later, Empress Elizabeth goes to the store to see the cream that everyone was talking about and makes it clear to Farma that she wants to be the first to see the new products. He then apologizes and presents a lip gloss to her, who is delighted with the result and comments that the companies that sold toxic beauty products are on the verge of going bankrupt. Sometime later, everyone goes to Farma's father's new land, which he got from the empress. While his father is taking care of business, Farma decides to go to the beach, and his father makes it clear to him not to go in the sea. But when he gets there, Blanche and Lot beg him to let them at least get their feet wet in the sea, and he gives in as long as they stay at the edge since they can't swim. Ellen then decides to go into the sea as well. Farma remembers her little sister in the other life who was also dying to go in the sea, but couldn't because she was too small, and Farma promised that next year when she would be older, they would swim together. But unfortunately, shortly after they discovered her illness, and he couldn't keep his promise. At this moment, the worst possible thing happens. Blanche ends up being carried away by the current, and before the others could think, Farma was already swimming after her, desperate, thinking that he would lose his little sister in that world too, with Blanche deeper and deeper into the water. In his desperation, Farma ends up activating his power and literally nullifies an entire part of the sea in an extremely sinister way and manages to save Blanche before she was in danger. He tells Aelin that he thinks it was a negative attribute, but she explains that even negative attributes don't do something like that. But with the power being creepy or not, thanks to it, Farma was able to save his little sister. At night, Farma realizes how risky it had been to remove all the water from the place, because the body is made of water and he could have removed the water from Ellen's body, and Blanche thinks that he really should be feared. Lot shows up and reassures him, saying that she wasn't afraid of him, but in awe of his power and heroism, and shows that she felt guilty for not going to Blanche's aid. But Farma also reassures her, saying that she did the right thing because she couldn't swim, so she would only have put her life at risk, and says that he would hate it if anything happened to her. In the end, they say goodbye, much more relieved after their conversation. Meanwhile, people in white hoodies report that they have heard rumors of a shadeless boy avoiding a part of the sea, and that if the rumors were true, they would have to eliminate him. The next day, one of the hooded guys shows up at Farma's pharmacy, leaving him a bit puzzled as they didn't seem interested in the store. At dawn, the guards shift change, an out-of-control horse carrying a cart ends up breaking into the pharmacy and destroying everything inside, clearly something set up by someone who didn't like Farma, who suspects the pharmacy guild or the guys in robes. However, despite the almost total destruction of the store, all the customers contributed to help with the renovation, making Farma thrilled to see how loved his pharmacy was. Suddenly, a young woman appears begging Farma to help her father. He then goes with her to the place where her father was, but when Farma notices that it was a very isolated area of the city, he realizes that he had fallen into a trap and was surrounded by the guys in hoods, inquisitors of the Sacred Kingdom, responsible for identifying divinity in children and selecting the governor of each nation, even being above the power of the empress. In other words, Farma was in a lot of trouble. Thinking that Farma was an evil spirit, they try to arrest him in several ways, but Farma blocks all their arrests, making them more and more scared, and they decide to attack to kill. Having no other choice, Farma defends himself and ends up knocking Commander Solomon off his horse. As Farma literally glows, demonstrating absurd power, he explains that he wants to use his abilities to heal and does not wish to hurt anyone, asking them to retreat. With the glow, they notice the mark of the god of drugs on his shoulder, and because they think Farma is an evil spirit, they come to consider him a god. They ask Farma for forgiveness, and Commander Solomon says that he would pay for his mistake with his death, but Farma stops him in time and realizes that he had fractured his leg in the fall and would need surgery. Despite being a pharmacist, he thinks that since surgeons at the time didn't have much knowledge and relied more on luck, he was the best option. He then performs the surgery on him, and fortunately everything goes well, and everyone thanks the god of drugs, who not only did not punish them but also saved the commander's life. Months later, Solomon shows up at Farma's pharmacy and makes it clear that he would use his position to help Farma hide his divine powers, and tells him that he has brought a gift from his temple, the rod of the drug god. Farma takes the stick, and it begins to light up, and Solomon says that he recognized the drug god, but when Ellen tries to hold it, the stick literally goes through her hand, and Solomon explains that only those who were not from that world could hold it. As if the stick couldn't be any better, Farma realizes that he could fly on it, like a little witch. On the way out, we find out that Solomon was not responsible for the cart, so the main suspect in fact was the guild owner Varen. And as if the gift of the staff was not enough, he gives Farma a talisman that would give him shade, so that his presence in the sun would not be suspicious. Farma proves to be more excited about the talisman than the stick, and explains that it is because with it, he would be able to walk around with his little sister and Lot without worry. And so Farma walks with the two quietly and thinks about how his pharmacy was growing and would need new partnerships and employees. Suddenly, he sees another pharmacy owned by a pharmacist named Pierre, with a customer wanting to buy the same products from Farma's store, but the store owner explains that plebs need a guild to make this partnership, and there was only the Varan Guild. Back at his store, Farma decides that in order to expand his pharmacy and to be able to release his products to other stores, he would need to have a guild, and so they begin preparations to create one. Meanwhile, Varan, the head of the guild, holds a meeting with all of his members to criticize Farma's pharmacy and makes it clear that anyone from the guild who went to that store would lose their business license. However, Pierre's daughter burns up in fever, and he tries to take her to several pharmacies, but they are all closed and he meets up with Farma. Having no other choice, Pierre goes to his store where Farma guides him to the back doors, which he thinks are the entrance for the plebs who could not enter through the front door, but he later finds out that it was really just to prevent his daughter's infection from spreading. And so, Farma examines her, showing an above-normal knowledge and care for the patients, leaving Pierre amazed at the treatment, the result, and the price, understanding why the customers no longer wanted to go to other pharmacies. At home, Pierre confesses to his wife that he needed to go to Farma's pharmacy, and she worries that if Varan found out, he would be expelled from the guild. But he comments that as a pharmacist, they should be learning from Farma to evolve and help people, and is saddened to think that if his wife or daughter got sick and depended on the guild, they would probably die because the treatment was so inferior and based on luck. And so, the next day, Varan holds another meeting with everyone in the guild to complain about Farma. Apparently, he didn't know how to do anything else. And they all complained that his pharmacy was really a problem because it was stealing all the customers, and it was dangerous for them to break down, and Farma, being a noble, could easily stop serving the plebs and leave them without a pharmacy. Sure, we know that Farma wouldn't do something like this, but it makes a little sense for them to be concerned. However, Varan asks Pierre, who was the closest store to Farma, for his opinion, and is surprised by his sincerity when he says that instead of seeing Farma as a threat, they could have him as a partner and learn from him, which was in fact a good solution. But everyone thinks it's absurd, and Pierre questions whether anyone from there has entered Farma's pharmacy, and they all deny it because they saw no reason to see the competition. But Pierre ends up saying that if they went there, they would understand why no one else goes to another pharmacy, making it clear that he himself had been there and loved it. With this, unfortunately, Pierre is expelled from the guild, being seen as a traitor. The next day, his pharmacy was destroyed, and he was desperate to work to support his family, since he needed the guild's permission to continue being a pharmacist. When Farma stops by his store to find out what had happened, he tells him that fortunately he has just won the empress permission to have a guild, and invites Pierre to be the first to join. And so he renovates his store, which now has the same products as Farma's pharmacy. Despite this, he is worried about whether he will have any customers with a new guild, but fortunately, when he opens the door, he is even thrilled to find a lot of people waiting for the store to open. In the end, all turns out well for Pierre, who not only continued with the guild, but gained more customers and the ability to give the customers the treatment he wanted. Some time passes, and at Farma's home at a family dinner, they receive a letter from Paul, Farma's older brother, who was in a medical school. He says in the letter that he would postpone his visit because of a strange epidemic that was breaking out that had already killed about 1,000 people, and that it was something contagious and probably contaminated goods were arriving by ship precisely in his father's land. Farma asks his father to order some kind of sample of the disease in order to have more information. Meanwhile, the Empress holds a meeting to reflect on all that Farma had done to improve the quality of medicine and thinks about granting him the title of Archduke, but he was still too young, and it would be impossible at the moment, but we can already see that the boy will certainly have a very important position as soon as he is old enough. Later, Farma receives an answer from his brother and finds out that the disease was the dreaded Black Plague and begins to make preparations to prevent it from spreading. He then reports everything to his father, who already suspected it was this disease, and is amazed at how quickly his son took all possible and imaginable precautions, including making the medicine needed for the treatment and sending a large quantity to partner pharmacies. However, they still needed to avoid contamination as much as possible, and they go to Elizabeth to inform her of what had happened, and there she agrees to limit the trade entries. Farma also explains that they should eliminate the disease carriers, fleas, and rodents, and with these measures, everything should be fine. He also finally creates a decent microscope which allows them to research without exposing themselves to disease. With this, the Black Plague is kept under control thanks to Farma's knowledge and everyone's help. Meanwhile, however, in the temple, a prisoner escapes from prison, an evil spirit. And so time passes with Farma and Ellen analyzing all the ships that were arriving with trades to ensure that the Black Plague did not reach land. Although everything is going under control, the crew becomes impatient with the delay in the inspection, complaining that the goods might spoil, and they even start arguing among themselves to be cleared first, but Jean, the Commodore of the Empire and Farma's first steady customer, shows up to help. Upon finishing inspecting the ships of the moment, Farma discovers that a nearby village had been contaminated by the plague, spreading rapidly with some goods they received from smugglers. After leaving Ellen in charge to continue inspecting the arriving ships, he flies with his stick to the village and discovers one more of his powers, the power to pass through objects. Once in the village, he arrives just in time to stop some people from leaving the place and explains that they cannot leave the village. They think that Farma was an evil spirit trying to lead them to death since the boy appeared out of nowhere, but quickly Farma arrests everyone with a huge ice sculpture and explains that he is a pharmacist who would give treatment to everyone and that they could not leave without treatment because besides spreading the disease they would die. Inside, he asks to isolate the infected from the non-infected and to separate those with severe symptoms to speed up the treatment. Meanwhile, Jane helps to keep the ships in order and sees a ship approaching, ignoring his orders. But as he gets closer, he finds that everyone on the ship is dead from the disease and regrets that some might have survived if they had received proper treatment and gives the order for his men to sink the ship. In the village, Farma had reached the end of his work, and now the most difficult part remains. The place where the critically ill patients were, and there he ends up meeting Solomon again. After using his vision, he discovers that 2 of the patients were there by mistake, for having mistaken plague symptoms for simple flu symptoms, and the other 12, most of them, could be treated. And so he treats them all with the help of Solomon and his people. Meanwhile, Ellen continued to handle the inspections in Farma's place, worried about whether she was doing a good job. After all, she didn't have an eye that showed who was infected or not. Meanwhile, a lady who was about to have her research work interrupted because of her retirement, with no one taking her seriously, is called to see Farma's father, who asks her to postpone her retirement since Farma had discovered that she possessed in her laboratory the substance needed to produce the plague remedy, so that everyone would no longer depend on him and his abilities to make the medicines. After a long day of work, Farma finally manages to treat everyone and get most of them out of their serious condition, heading back to the road home when he notices smoke and goes to the scene. The people of the Sacred Kingdom had captured the smugglers responsible for contaminating the village, and in exchange for a treatment of the disease, they confessed that they had been paid to transport some boxes, one of which was carrying rats, transmitters of the Black Plague, from the very place where the epidemic had started. Farma reflects that the epidemic may have been caused on purpose by someone who wants to destroy the Empire, which would explain the Empress' contamination with the White Plague. Meanwhile, in the capital, Lot distributes masks to prevent the disease when they suffer an invasion of 5 holy knights who release rodents everywhere. Flying squirrels, no faster way to spread the disease than this. Meanwhile, the evil spirit watched the chaos quietly. Farma's father asks the Empress to take the plague medicine as a precaution and tells her that they are trying to contaminate the Empire on purpose and that he suspects it is his former colleague, the brilliant but mentally unsound pharmacist, who was imprisoned for performing horrible experiments on humans and who had his divine arts sealed off, and his research was precisely on epidemics, which is why he is suspected. Everyone tries to stop the 5 knights when Solomon appears and pulls out his divine arts just as Farma finally arrives in time to hear them confess that they didn't even know what they were carrying and were only taking orders from an evil spirit that had threatened them, and his father recognizes from the description that it was indeed his former colleague. Meanwhile, Lot, along with Cadric, decides to go back to the pharmacy, right where the evil spirit was. Farma and his father notice his presence and run there as well. Arriving at the door of the pharmacy, Lot sees that the place was open and thinks it is Farma and runs to see him, and Cadric follows worried, thinking that it might not be Farma. And in fact, he was right. The evil spirit appears behind him, swinging a sword at him. When Farma arrives, his 2 friends are already wounded by a blow that possesses several poisons. While his father keeps his former colleague busy, Farma works hard to get all the poisons out of their bodies as quickly as possible. When he finishes, he discovers that the evil spirit had gone there to use his medicines to make powerful poisons and tries to convince Farma to join him by saying that he would also be judged by society for his power. But of course, Farma denies this and says that a pharmacist must use his abilities to heal and knocks the creature out the window. Then Farma jumps up, killing him with a swipe of his staff that turns everything into a rainbow glitter, and Solomon recognizes that it was another of the drug god's powers, called the Purification Shrine, used to eliminate evil spirits, and so all ends well. Time passes, and Lot and Cedric receive proper treatment. Ellen continued her work inspecting the ships, and Farma distributing enough treatments for all the pharmacists, and with the little lady's research, vaccines would soon be available. And so 2 months later, the Empress declares the end of the epidemic, and everyone celebrates at a fair. Finally, Parallel World Pharmacy is back in business, with many customers as usual, to the joy of Farma.